Hey guys, it's Christopher. Today's episode is all about brainless people messing with dangerous animals. From a Karen who unlatched a crocodile holding pin, to a Karen who decided to go look for a leopard herself. Let's start with northern Queensland, a private crocodile facility where a woman convinced the group that the signs were just legal formalities. It was March 14th, 2015. A small private reptile and wildlife facility sat on the outskirts of a rural town in northern Queensland, Australia. Handwritten signs on the roadside, a wooden booth at the entrance, gravel paths connecting a handful of open-air enclosures. The air was thick and humid, wet season just winding down, everything smelling like standing water and raw feed. Pamela Storch was 44, a property manager from Brisbane who had driven up with two coworkers for a long weekend. The facility wasn't even part of the plan. She spotted a flyer at their motel and insisted they stop in. 5 minutes in, she was already arguing with the guide. She told him the enclosure layouts didn't match what she'd seen described online and asked whether the animals were actually wild or just bred in captivity. At one point, she turned to the group and said the guide clearly had no idea what he was talking about and that she'd read more about this facility than he probably had. By the halfway point, she'd moved on to complaining that the animals weren't active enough, the tour was too slow. The whole thing felt like false advertising, and she was going to say so in her review. When the guide asked everyone to stay back from the monitor lizard enclosure, Pamela walked straight up to the mesh, pressed her fingers against it, and told her coworker that warning signs at these places meant nothing. So here's some context on what they were actually dealing with. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile on the planet. Adult males can reach 17 feet and push well past 1,000 pounds. And that stillness everyone always mistakes for laziness, that's not the animal being inactive. That's a predator on a hair trigger. When they move, they are already on you before you've registered it. There is no warning. By the time the group reached the holding area, they'd been walking about 30 minutes. It was a secondary pen used to separate animals during feeding rotations. Concrete floor, chain link fencing, a single gate with a sliding bolt latch, and a handwritten staff only sign on it. The guide had flagged it at the very start of the tour. Don't touch the gate, stay on the gravel path. The crocodile inside was a large adult male lying completely still near the far end of the enclosure, tucked into the shadow along the back wall. Pamela stared at him for a moment, then said the sign was probably just there for legal reasons, and that these facilities put warning signs on everything to avoid getting sued. Then, she walked up to the gate. She pulled the bolt open, pushed it back, then opened it again, with her eyes on the crocodile the whole time, waiting for some kind of reaction. When it didn't move, she took that as confirmation, and opened the gate a third time, wider, leaning her weight forward against it. I genuinely have no idea what she thought that crocodile was going to do. Just sit there forever? What happened next took under 2 seconds. The crocodile launched from the far wall, and the distance between them was gone before anyone could do anything about it. It hit Pamela at the lower left leg, and she went straight down. The death roll started before she finished hitting the ground. One hard rotation, and what followed was something nobody in that group was prepared to see. Staff reached the area within minutes, drove the animal back with a handling pole, and secured the gate. Emergency services were contacted immediately by radio. The facility sat 34 miles from the nearest trauma-capable medical center on roads that don't move fast. Response time was just over 40 minutes. Pamela Storch was pronounced dead at the scene. The post-mortem confirmed complete degloving of the lower left leg and full severance of the femoral artery at the upper thigh. Cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, with time of death estimated at 4 to 6 minutes after the initial strike. The bolt latch came back fully functional, manually operated, Pamela's fingerprints on it. Witness accounts from 3 members of the tour group confirmed she had opened and closed that gate multiple times before the attack. The case was ruled accidental. The holding area was permanently closed to visitor access, and no charges were filed. Pamela convinced herself that a crocodile, lying still, was basically a non-issue, and decided the best way to test that theory was to open its gate. Next one I've got is out of Thailand, a woman at an elephant interaction program who thought pulling a several-ton animal by the ear was a reasonable way to get it moving. It was September 3rd, 2016. A small elephant interaction program operated out of a rural property on the northern edge of Chiang Mai province, Thailand. Dirt paths, a wide open clearing with packed red earth, a shallow watering area at the far end. It was mid-morning and already pushing past 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that makes everything feel heavier than it should. Lupe Garston was 51, an office administrator from Phoenix, Arizona, traveling through Southeast Asia on a 2-week solo trip she had been planning for over a year. The elephant program was the centerpiece of her itinerary, booked months in advance. She had worked briefly at a petting zoo in her 20s, and she carried that around like it translated directly to handling a multi-ton wild animal. She had also noted on her booking form that she had previous experience with horses. which by that point she had apparently stacked on top of everything else as further proof that she knew what she was doing. Asian elephants are not the slow, passive animals most people picture. Adult females average between 5,000 and 8,800 pounds and can move at up to 15 miles per hour when agitated. They communicate discomfort through specific physical signals, ear position, head shaking, foot shuffling, long before they escalate physically. A mahout spends years learning to read a single individual animal. Their instructions during an interaction are not suggestions. The session started without issues. The group was introduced to 2 female elephants by their assigned mahouts. Lupe was paired with the larger of the 2, an adult female estimated at around 8,800 pounds. The mahout gave a clear briefing before any contact began. To move slowly, follow his lead, do not lay a finger on the animal, stay on the left side unless directed otherwise. For the first 10 minutes, Lupe followed along, feeding the elephant from a basket of fruit the facility provided. But her patience wore thin once the mahout began guiding the elephant in a slow arc around the clearing. Lupe had decided she wanted to walk toward the watering area instead, and when the elephant didn't respond to the direction she wanted, she reached up and grabbed the animal's left ear with one hand and pulled. She'd handled horses before, volunteered at a shelter, worked a petting zoo so clearly she knew what she was doing with an animal 20 times the size of anything she'd ever dealt with. The mahout stepped in immediately, repositioning himself and giving a firm verbal command to settle the elephant. It worked. The elephant paused. Lupe let go briefly, then grabbed the ear again with both hands, pulling downward and to the left with more force. The mahout physically placed himself between her and the elephant's head and gestured firmly for her to step back. She stepped around him and grabbed the ear a third time. The elephant swung its head hard to the side to shake off the irritation. Fast, forceful, the kind of motion that doesn't leave room for reaction time. The momentum caught Lupe across the upper body and launched her sideways. She landed hard on the packed dirt several feet away and didn't move. The mahout got the elephant under control and moved it back immediately. Staff reached Lupe within minutes. She was conscious at first, responsive, but couldn't feel anything below her waist. A vehicle reached the clearing within several minutes, and she was loaded in as carefully as possible. The roads between the program site and the nearest spinal trauma facility were rough and partially unpaved, and with over 25 miles between them, the drive alone took close to 50 minutes. There was no faster option. Lupe Garston died en route. Witness accounts from 6 members of the group were consistent throughout. The mahout's conduct was reviewed and confirmed as appropriate at every point. Lupe's repeated grabbing of the elephant's ear against direct instruction was identified as the sole trigger for the animal's reaction. The post-mortem identified a burst fracture of the T12 vertebra with complete spinal cord transection at that level, consistent with the compressive force of a high-impact fall onto packed earth. 3 ribs on the left side were fractured, and the spleen was lacerated. Cause of death was neurogenic shock, secondary to complete spinal cord injury, with internal hemorrhage from the splenic laceration as a contributing factor. The case was ruled accidental, and no charges were filed. Somehow, horse background was all it took for Lupe to decide she could handle an elephant. From Thailand, we go to Central Florida, where a woman who walked into a big cat facility genuinely believed she could communicate with a Bengal tiger. It was June 22nd, 2014. A small private big cat facility sat on a rural property about 12 miles outside a mid-sized town in Central Florida. A privately run operation offering paid walkthrough tours and closer viewing sessions near the primary cat enclosures. Heavy gauge chain link fencing, a secondary rope line about 6 feet in front of each enclosure, 91 degrees Fahrenheit with no cloud cover, and it wasn't even noon yet. Maeve Pulford was 47, an office supervisor from Gainesville, who had driven out with her sister for what she'd been calling a bucket list trip for weeks. She'd never been anywhere near a tiger before that day, but you genuinely would not know that. From listening to her, she had opinions about big cat behavior, and she was not keeping them to herself. Most people have no real frame of reference for what a Bengal tiger actually is up close. Adult males run between 400 and 570 pounds and can hit 40 miles per hour over short distances. Bite force around 1,050 pounds per square inch, enough to go straight through bone. They are ambush predators through, and anything that holds their attention from outside an enclosure, noise, movement, sustained eye contact, can flip a predatory response fast. When that happens, the animal isn't sizing you up anymore. It's already decided. The tour moved through several enclosures before reaching the main tiger viewing area. The handler had been clear from the start. Stay behind the rope line, no sudden movements, no noise directed at the animals. Maeve spent most of the tour talking over him, telling the people around her that big cats are naturally drawn to nurturing behavior, and that handlers at places like this tend to overcomplicate things for liability reasons. The handler corrected her directly, and she responded by asking him how long he'd actually worked with big cats, then carried on with what she was saying. She had also come prepared, somewhere between the entrance and the tiger enclosure. She had pulled out a piece of fruit she'd brought from outside the facility. She was already holding it by the time the group reached the viewing area, which tells you exactly where her head was at before she even got there. The adult male inside was pacing slowly along the far side when the group arrived. Maeve moved to the front, closest to the rope line, and watched him for about a minute. Then she crouched down, crossed the rope line without anyone catching it right away, and pushed the fruit through the feeding hatch at the base of the fence. Then she made a low, soft sound, the kind you'd use to call a house cat. The tiger stopped pacing. She was crouched at the base of a tiger enclosure, pushing food through the fence, while the handler was actively telling her to stop. At some point, the confidence had completely overtaken whatever common sense was left. She pushed a second piece through. The tiger had fully oriented toward her now, weight shifting forward, ears flat. The handler moved in immediately, telling her to step back and get her hand away from the gap. She pulled back slightly, but stayed right where she was. Then she pushed a third piece through. The tiger hit the chain link at full speed with zero buildup and drove its right forepaw through the gap at mid-fence height. The claws caught Maeve at the left side of the neck, tearing through the jugular vein and carotid artery, and dragged down across her upper chest in a single motion. She went down hard several feet back from the fence. Her sister was screaming. The handler was already next to Maeve on the ground. The neck wound was bleeding fast and heavily, and nothing on site was going to slow that down. Emergency services were called immediately and got there in about 19 minutes. It wasn't enough time. Maeve Pulford was pronounced dead on site. The post-mortem put time of death between 12 and 16 minutes after the strike. The external jugular vein and carotid artery had both been severed, and with no surgical capability anywhere close to that location, there was no realistic window to work with. Cause of death was exsanguination from the jugular laceration, with a hairline clavicle fracture noted as a secondary finding from the force of the strike. Fruit residue at the base of the fence matched what she had brought in. The chain link was examined and came back completely intact, the gap standard specification and unaltered. Every account from the tour group pointed to the same sequence of events. Handler's conduct was reviewed and cleared. The case was ruled accidental, and the facility was cleared of any responsibility. Somehow the most dangerous thing in that facility wasn't the tiger. It was the confidence of the woman standing outside its enclosure. That brings us to a shallow water shark tour off the Florida coast where, as it turns out, the nurse sharks were the least of everyone's problems. It was August 9th, 2017. A small independent tour operation ran shallow water marine encounters out of a narrow inlet on the southeastern coast of Florida, about 6 miles from the nearest populated shoreline. Flat-bottomed boat, a single guide, and a sandbar where nurse sharks had been congregating naturally for years. Shay Portwell was 39, a marketing coordinator from Atlanta, on a 4-day coastal trip with 2 friends. She had found the shark encounter through a local activity board at their accommodation and signed the whole group up without asking anyone first. She had no diving or snorkeling experience and had never been in open water with marine animals before. On the boat ride out, she told the group that nurse sharks were basically harmless and the most docile sharks in the water. She said it like she'd been diving with sharks her whole life. Here's the thing though, nurse sharks and bull sharks are not the same animal, and that distinction ended up mattering more than anything else that day. Nurse sharks are slow, bottom-dwelling, generally unbothered unless grabbed or harassed. Bull sharks are a completely different situation. They average 7 to 8 feet, weigh up to 500 pounds, and are considered one of the most aggressive shark species in the world. They're drawn to low-frequency vibrations in the water, the kind generated by a struggling or thrashing animal. They don't need much of a reason to come in. The guide ran through the briefing before anyone got in. Don't grab the sharks. Don't chase them. Don't block their path. Stay still if one approaches. He also flagged that the incoming tide occasionally pushed other species into the inlet, and that everyone needed to exit immediately on his signal. Nothing complicated, nothing unclear. Shay was in the water less than 5 minutes before she started cutting off one of the nurse sharks, repositioning herself directly in its path and forcing it to redirect around her. Then she started slapping the water surface flat with her palm. Once, then again, then repeatedly in this deliberate rhythmic pattern. The guide moved toward her and told her to stop. She told him she'd read that certain water movements attract sharks and that she was just trying to get a better experience since they'd paid good money for the tour. She was deliberately generating vibrations in open water to pull in more sharks, with other people standing in that same water around her. I don't know what she thought was going to show up. More nurse sharks? She kept going. The guide was already signaling the group toward the boat. The water around Shay was churning with the kind of low-frequency disturbance that carries a long way underwater. The bull shark had likely already been pushed close to the sandbar by the incoming tide. The sustained surface disturbance gave it something to orient on. It came in fast and low from the north and hit Shay at the left side of the abdomen in a single pass before anyone in that water had time to react. The force lifted her partially out of the water, and she went face down within seconds. The guide reached her first and pulled her toward the boat with help from another participant. Getting her out of the water took about 90 seconds. The bull shark made one more pass near the boat but didn't strike again. The guide had a trauma kit on board, but the wound was open and severe, and there wasn't much he could do beyond applying pressure. He radioed for emergency assistance immediately. A response vessel reached them in just under 25 minutes. Shay Portwell was airlifted from the response vessel. She died during transport. The guide's radio log and GPS data were both recovered. A waterproof camera mounted on the boat's console had been running the entire time and captured everything. All 4 remaining tour participants gave accounts that matched the footage. The abdominal wound told the whole story at post-mortem. One bite that tore open the left abdomen, severing a major artery and destroying surrounding tissue. Cause of death was hemorrhagic shock. 6 miles from shore, with that kind of internal damage, there was never going to be enough time. Shay's repeated slapping of the water surface was identified as a significant contributing factor in the shark's approach. The case was ruled accidental and no charges were filed. Paying good money for a tour and then deliberately trying to attract more sharks into the water is one way to spend a morning in Florida. Over in Zambia, a woman on a hippo boat tour took it upon herself to splash water toward a hippopod because the animals weren't doing enough for her liking. It was February 18th, 2016. A small independent river tour operation ran daily excursions along a slow-moving stretch of the Luangwa River in eastern Zambia. Flat-bottomed fiberglass vessels, no more than 10 passengers per boat. A single guide running the motor and the commentary at the same time. The river averaged about 6 feet deep in the main channel, with exposed sandbanks where hippos congregated during the cooler morning hours. Alma Brimwick was 55, a retired school administrator from Scottsdale, Arizona, on a group tour through southern Africa. The river excursion was already on the itinerary. It was not her pick, but she had opinions about it before she even stepped on the boat. She'd done 2 safaris before this, both vehicle-based, and had spent most of this trip telling anyone who'd listen that everything was too controlled and too safe. She wanted what she kept calling a real encounter. Most people pack sunscreen for a river tour. Alma packed a paddle. Most people get hippos completely wrong. They look slow and unbothered, and because they're herbivores, people assume they're passive, but none of that holds up. Adult males can push close to 9,900 pounds, move at nearly 19 miles per hour on land, and their bite force sits around 1,800 pounds per square inch. They are intensely territorial in water and will charge and capsize boats that get too close, especially when there are juveniles in the pod. The boat had been on the water about 25 minutes when the guide slowed the motor and pointed out a pod of 7 hippos resting on a sandbank about 80 feet off the side of the boat. He cut the motor to a low idle, told the group to stay seated and keep noise down, and explained that the pod had at least 1 juvenile, and that the adults would be watching for anything they read as a threat. Alma had been sitting with her collapsible paddle assembled across her knees since they left the dock. The guide had clocked it, but hadn't said anything yet since it wasn't in use. That changed the moment the hippos came into view. She extended the paddle over the side and started slapping the water surface in short, deliberate strokes, eyes on the pod the whole time. The guide told her to pull it in, and she told him flat out that she hadn't come all this way to sit on a boat and do nothing. He told her a second time, and she said she was a paying customer and that splashing a paddle in a river wasn't hurting anyone. She was 80 feet from a hippopod on a river in Zambia, and her complaint was that nothing was happening. Whatever a real encounter meant to her, she was about to get one. The nearest adult male, a large bull at the water's edge of the sandbank, lifted his head. His ears rotated. He slid into the water and submerged almost immediately. The guide told everyone to hold on and reached for the throttle. The hippo covered the distance underwater with no visible approach. The animal came up hard from below and to the side of the boat in a single upward lunge that lifted the right side of the vessel clean out of the water. The boat came back down hard, throwing several passengers off their seats. Alma had been leaning over the side with the paddle still in the water and went overboard on the downswing. She entered the water about 15 feet from the sandbank, and the hippo was on her within seconds. One bite to the upper torso, pulling her under immediately. The guide had the motor at full throttle and was moving the boat away. The hippo surfaced once more about 20 feet out and then didn't come up near them again. Alma didn't resurface. Emergency contact was made by radio from the boat. A recovery team reached the location about 2 hours later and found Alma's body on the riverbed in roughly 5 feet of water, about 30 feet downstream from where she went in. The guide's radio log and passenger accounts from 8 people on the boat all lined up consistently. The collapsible paddle was recovered from the water near the boat and confirmed as Alma's personal equipment, nothing the tour operator had provided. The post-mortem found the chest had been crushed beyond any survivable point, both lungs, the shoulder, everything. Cause of death was recorded as traumatic asphyxiation, with drowning as a contributing factor. Alma's repeated striking of the water near the hippopod was identified as the direct trigger. The case was ruled accidental, and the reserve faced no legal consequences. Bringing your own paddle to a hippo boat tour to stir things up is a special kind of confidence. Last one we have is out in the South African bush, a guided leopard tracking walk where a woman decided the guide was taking too long and figured she'd handle it herself. It was November 7th, 2015. A small private game reserve ran guided walking safaris through a stretch of mixed bushveld in the Limpopo province of South Africa. Dense acacia scrub broken up by open grassland and dry riverbeds. Not a fenced tourist park. Working wilderness, small groups of no more than 6, led by a single armed field guide. The afternoon walk had departed at 3:45 p.m. with a plan to be back before dusk around 6:15. Cora Drumwell was 48, a senior buyer for a retail chain based in Charlotte, North Carolina, traveling through southern Africa on a private itinerary she'd put together herself. She'd never done a walking safari before. She'd booked this one specifically after reading about it and deciding it was the most immersive wildlife experience available. What she didn't account for was that immersive also meant following someone else's lead the entire time, and that part she had no interest in. She'd been openly criticizing the guide to the other walkers for most of the trek, telling them he clearly didn't know where the leopard was, that they were covering the same ground twice, and that the whole thing felt like a waste of an afternoon. The guide had spent the better part of an hour tracking fresh signs, pug marks in soft soil near a dry riverbed, a partially cached impala carcass wedged in a low acacia about 300 yards back. But Cora had already made up her mind that he was lost, and nothing he did on that walk was going to change it. Leopards are worth understanding before going any further here, because they are not animals that give you a warning. Adults range from 66 to 200 pounds for males. Built entirely for ambush, most active at dawn and dusk. They attack from behind, back of the neck or the throat, one sustained bite. A leopard can sit within 10 feet of a person in dense bush and give absolutely no indication it's there whatsoever. It was approaching 5:30 p.m. when the guide stopped the group and crouched to examine a fresh pug mark in the soil. The leopard had passed through within the last hour based on the moisture at the edge of the print. He signaled everyone to hold position and stay tight. Cora had been drifting to the back of the group for the last 20 minutes, consistently falling a few steps behind, pausing, putting distance between herself and the guide every time he wasn't looking her way. He gestured her forward twice, and she'd complied briefly both times before drifting back again. She didn't hold position this time either. While the guide was crouched over the pug mark, Cora picked up a dry stick from the ground and started snapping it and dragging it through the bush cover off to the left of the path. She'd seen something similar in a wildlife program once and decided that was how you flushed an animal out of cover. She was done waiting. She moved further left, away from the group, snapping branches, rustling the scrub, working her way along the edge of the thicket at dusk, in active leopard territory. The guide stood up and turned toward her. He was already moving in her direction. The leopard came out of the acacia thicket to Cora's left and hit her from behind before anyone had registered it was there, driving her face down onto the ground and biting down on the back of her neck immediately. The guide fired a single shot into the air within seconds. The leopard released and was gone back into the scrub, the whole thing over in under 10 seconds. Cora was face down and unresponsive, and the guide reached her within seconds, rolling her carefully. The neck wound was severe, and the damage was immediately obvious. He got on the satellite communicator, relayed their position, and a vehicle came out from the main camp about 4 miles away via Fire Road and got there roughly 35 minutes after the attack. Cora Drumwell was confirmed dead at the vehicle. The leopard's bite went straight through the back of her neck, fracturing 2 vertebrae and severing the spinal cord. Fatal on contact. No window. Nothing anyone could have done. Claw lacerations on her upper back and left shoulder were consistent with the force of the strike. Cause of death was spinal cord severance. The satellite log, pug mark evidence, and the cached impala carcass all confirmed the timeline and active leopard territory in that area. Every account from the group lined up, and the guide's conduct was cleared. Cora's decision to break away and disturb the bush cover at dusk was identified as the sole contributing factor, and the case was closed as accidental.